Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is part C of our lecture on the Renaissance, focusing on point number 4 on your screen, the artistic Renaissance. And so, as always, take a moment, hit pause, jot down the lecture outline, and pay attention to the rest of those key terms. Let's get started. And so what we see here during what we call the artistic Renaissance. The early leader of this was the city of Florence. Florence emerges as the leader in art in the early 1400s, and it happens because of massive patronage. Now, patronage means that someone is commissioning these pieces of art. Someone is paying to beautify their homes, beautify their cities. They're paying for the art and architecture. And of course, in Florence, the big family was the Medici family. And again, if you go to Florence, you will go to the Medici Museum. It's still in existence. Some of the greatest works of art, and no air conditioner, because the fear is air conditioning will hurt the pieces of art that have stood for hundreds of years, and so no air conditioning. Good luck in the summer. Now, so in essence, the wealth of Florence, due to trade, due to revived economy during the early Renaissance, is going to mirror the superb artistic output of the Renaissance. And of course, a good example of this is Donatello's David, which I'll show you in a few minutes, which will stand in the Medici courtyard during the wedding of Lorenzo de' Medici. And if you remember correctly, he's the son of Cosimo. And Lorenzo the Great, the Magnificent, he will be the one who will be one of the most massive patrons of art in the world. Now, we will also see, in addition to private families, the church itself will become a major patron of arts. They saw art as being a way to glorify God and, of course, beautify their own churches. And so when we see the decline of Florence in the late 1500s, we will see a shift in the Renaissance from Florence to Rome. And Pope Alexander VI, he becomes the most notorious of the Renaissance popes. He will spend huge sums of money on the patronage of the arts to build many things and commission many works, such as Michelangelo's dome atop atop St. Peter's Cathedral, picture on the right. You will also see the paintings of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. The sculpture of the Pieta is located within the cathedral inside the basilica. Again, if you ever have a chance to go to Rome, go there. My wife and I thought we'd spend a half a day there. We were being pushed out the door at closing time because it was just so amazing to be inside the basilica. And so you start seeing not only art that we think about, artistic representation, paintings, but also architecture, whether it is the Duomo in Florence, which again is beautiful. In fact, you can walk up to the top of the Duomo still. It's kind of fun because it's like a spiral staircase that wraps all the way around it. And you have to walk like this the entire time because, the dome is curving in on you. So you have to kind of, especially for me who's 6 foot tall, I have to walk on an angle the entire time. Beautiful to overlook the city, though. It's gorgeous. Now, one of the things that defines this, though, again, so we're going to get some background here before we get to actually show some artwork. One of the things that defines this is a new way of doing art, right? So we talked about how in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, it was all about these, what's called bas reliefs on wood, right? They're trying to create a little bit of dimension by making it protrude from wood, but largely painting is still two-dimensional. And so the use of naturalism during the Renaissance becomes a primary way to achieve their primary goal, which was imitate nature, make it look realistic, make perfection. And so in painting, they begin to use what's called perspective. Now, what is perspective? Well, it's to create a three-dimensional effect, an illusion, on a two-dimensional surface. Perspective. And hence, this rebirth during the Renaissance is different because they use the idea of perspective. Let me give another example of perspective. Notice this. This is perspective. This is known as by Masaccio, known as the Trinity. And this is a very famous painting in Florence. Got a chance to see this one. And this painting, if you look at it, it creates this focal point you see by the X there. But by doing this and creating this depth of perceptive three-dimensional effect, this perspective effect, you're able to look just above the head of Jesus on the cross, see, God the Father behind him, and you're able to create this illusion in your mind that this is not just a wall, right? This is not just flat against the wall. This is actually, you're looking at a three-dimensional object. And so medieval work, of course, in contrast, was very flat, very two-dimensional. This is a three-dimensional image. In addition, they used a thing known as chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro was the use of dark, let me go back to my picture real quick so you can see it, the use of dark and light colors as a way to create an illusion of depth. Again, by using darker colors in the back, brighter colors in the front, you're able to create that illusion that there is, in fact, depth. So perspective and this chiaroscuro. Now, in addition, we start seeing a little more human face ideas, and we also develop what's known as the sfumato. The sfumato is S-F-U-M-A-T-O. It's developed by Leonardo da Vinci. It's a technique that you're blurring or softening the sharp outlines. And again, this is meant to create a more realistic, imitate nature idea. Now, in addition, with sculptures, let me give you a couple of examples here. So classicism, again, part of these ideas that we are going to, so let me show you. On the right there, you see the classical pose. You shift the weight to one leg. Often you see, well, there's a lot of religious, images. We start seeing a lot more secularism. We start seeing freestanding figures rather than collective units. And of course, they believe in symmetry and balance. Now, there we go. Now, one of the big things here also, and you see the facial idea here, is the use of these geometric shapes, this geometrical arrangement of figures. Why? Because they're striving for perfection, right? We're striving for, again, to imitate nature in its fullest. And so you get things like this. The figure itself is architecture. The individual is glorified. And of course, this is Madonna with child. Madonna means Mary, by the way. But look at the geometric shapes. Again, this is about perfection. And of course, Da Vinci was all about perfection. Now, I'm going to go through a few examples. So remember, these are artworks that were produced during the Renaissance period of some very famous artists. I'm giving you an example of the ones that College Board says that you guys should know, right? This is the big thing. And again, you can see here that there's some big changes here. You see this idea of symmetry. We see this idea of balance. We see this idea of perfection. We see this idea of perspective. So in all these artworks, look at perspective. Look for the chiaroscuro. And the idea that softening and blurring of the edges to create depth. And this is a very, very early one. Notice this is being painted in 1305 at the very beginning of the Renaissance by Giotto. Now, Giotto is considered perhaps maybe the world's first Renaissance painter. And again, he's not mastered this technique yet. He doesn't have that perspective down, but he does use that chiaroscuro to create the illusion of three dimension on a two-dimensional plane. Next, the Florence, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, Il Duomo. Again, this was won by a contest of Filippo Brunelleschi. He will create a 100-foot dome in the center of Florence that stands way above anything else in the city. It's a symbol of the power, piety, and ingenuity of Florentine power. Again, being financed by the Medici family. Now, this becomes his masterpiece. And he actually becomes the father of perspective through his architecture and through his artwork. But again, Brunelleschi's famous work is Il Duomo. At the same time, though, we have these bronze doors in Florence. Now, you can't see these outside anymore. They actually moved them inside behind glass to preserve them. There is a fake replica of them you can see outside that stands just across the narrow street between the Il Duomo, the cathedral and these doors. Now, the funny part was Brunelleschi wanted to create these doors. He was wanted to be the one commissioned and paid to make these doors. Unfortunately, he lost out to a competitor, Lorenzo Ghiberti. Ghiberti is the one who will produce these ornate doors, and you can't see it. I can't get a good enough image of these, but each panel is a separate biblical scene. And the detail of these bronze doors is immaculate. Now, the only downside is through modern pollution, these doors began to tarnish, so they had to move them indoor and restore them, and now there are fake doors outside that don't quite have the impact. But again, these are directly across the street. And when I say street, these are one-way small car, like picture a smart car. That's how wide these streets are. So these are tiny. So again, you have Ghiberti. Donatello's David. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. So this is, Donatello. This is incredibly important because his bronze statue of David is very, first of all, unique. Now, this is not representing the idea of Greek and Roman art. I get that. But he has a couple things that are important. One, it's the first bronze statue of David since, antiquity. But more important, he's the first Renaissance artist to utilize a nude figure in sculpture. The idea of creating perfection, the idea of preserving and portraying nature at its finest. And in addition, you start seeing other things also, like this is not your manly man David here. Now, there are some that I'm going to do a comparison, show you later, compared to Michelangelo's David. But Donatello's David portrays him in a very unique light. Now, this is the warrior David, the conqueror, the boy who at one point killed the giant Goliath, the one who was able to rip a lion and a bear, and kill both of them with his bare hands to save his sheep as a shepherd. This is the man who will become the greatest king in the history of Israel. Right? This is the great David. But if you look at this statue of him, yes, he's a conquering hero. He's got the sword. He's got the armor of Goliath down on his feet. Yeah, he's got that. Got the helmet. That's not a warrior's helmet. He's not dressed in full armor. In fact, he's not muscular at all. For lack of a better term, he's portrayed very feminine. Again, this is that Renaissance ideal of that you should be a man who's learned, right? You should be educated, study philosophy, study education, study art. And so he's a very feminized David, which is very unique, in addition to being the first nude sculpture in the Renaissance period. Next, we have Masaccio. I keep saying Masaccio. It's Masaccio. He is a painter who is the first Renaissance painter to portray real human nude figures and portray them in that three-dimensional style. So his most famous painting is known as the expulsion of Adam and Eve. So they're being expelled from the Garden of Eden after Eve eats the fruit and Adam does well. And again, it's a fresco. It shows the tremendous emotion of the moment. Again, it's that facial expression that's new to the Renaissance. Like it's the new painting techniques that allowed Renaissance artists to capture that emotion. Something that was lacking when it came to the Middle Ages. Again, seriously, go back and look at the Middle Ages. Babies have faces of like old men. Like they did not know how to paint faces. But in the Renaissance, they start trying to get that perfection idea and start portraying those real images and portraying people at their core. So yes, there are many nude pictures as well. One of the most famous is Botticelli. Now, Botticelli paints one of the most famous paintings known as The Birth of Venus. And this is a great example of humanism because the subject here is not religious. This is a Roman goddess, right? This is the birth of Venus. And thus, we start seeing that this is the Roman goddess of love, right? And you notice a few things here. One is, yes, it's a nude figure, the perfection. But you also notice that she's standing in the contrapposto position, where you lean more heavily on. Let me go back to Donatello real quick. Again, you see him leaning. You see her leaning. This is known as the contrapposto position of most architecture and paintings you start seeing with more weight on one leg than the other. This is all done by design to portray this, very humanistic aspect of this. And another one of the more famous ones is known as by the Primavera, spring. Once again, you have these naked, sprites. You have this, kind of frivolous dance. And again, this is a very humanist idea because it's not necessarily religious. And again, zoom in on her face. Again, the detail of her face. It looks almost like a photograph rather than an actual painting. Now, as there would be a shift from Florence to Rome, we enter the period known as the High Renaissance. This is being led by the Pope Alexander VI, and later Julius II, because they become very important idea that they consider, man, look what's going on in Florence, but what if we use patronage of the arts to enhance the church's stature? So they begin to fund and pay for these famous Renaissance artists to come and beautify Rome, beautify the churches, and to basically, restore the grandeur of Rome. Now, and so we start seeing that they will embrace the idealization of nature as well as the realism of humanity. They like humanism. They want religious figures. They want to portray biblical scenes, but they want it done in this very humanistic way, whether it's naked figures or whether it's just that realistic expression. So we enter the phase known as the High Renaissance. The question is, why would they do this? Well, prestige of the church. But think about, how do they fund this? Oh yeah, they must either A, tax, or start taking more money from the tithes and offerings, not to go to God's kingdom, but, well, in their minds they are. They're developing God's kingdom by building the grandeur of Rome. And, of course, the Vatican City. And so the characteristics of the High Renaissance period are classical balance, harmony, and restraint. And we see Bramante is the first one we're going to talk about here. He's an architect. And, of course, the San Pietro marks the beginning of what's known as the High Renaissance in 1502, when Pope Alexander VI appoints him to build a sanctuary that marks the alleged spot where St. Peter was crucified. And so he started building St. Peter's Cathedral. And he becomes the principal architect of the rebuilt St. Peter's Cathedral that is we now know today. And again, if you ever have to go. It's beautiful. Now, so he was the principal architect of the rebuilding of the. Now he's going to die, and actually Michelangelo's going to take over and alter some of his plans to finish and complete St. Peter's Cathedral and ultimately St. Peter's Dome. So of course we have some very famous painters here, artists, Renaissance men. And of course, very famously, is Leonardo da Vinci, who becomes the quintessential Renaissance man. He's a painter, a sculptor, an architect, an engineer, a writer, a scientist, and he will produce some of the most beautiful masterpieces in the world, including, of course, the Mona Lisa. Notice, of course, he uses that technique of sfumato, the idea that he softens the edges and blurs the lines to create this more three-dimensional image. Other famous works by Da Vinci, the Virgin of the Rocks. So again, he paints both secular and religious images. Again, notice his use of geometry to create focal points, to create perspective, to create 3D images, and to create balance and perfection. Another one of his very famous artworks, The Last Supper. Again, notice the geometry. And so you have these polygons, right? Except for Jesus in the center. That way your focal point is in the center and the perspective goes right above Jesus' head. Therefore, you get that perspective, that three-dimensional idea. Where's the focus point? Perspective, right at Jesus. This is the focus point of the art. It's not just a two-dimensional piece. Oh, one more just for all you conspiracy theorists out there. You have John there leaning just to Jesus' right hand, which is where he supposedly was in the Last Supper. Is that John or is that Mary Magdalene? Because it looks awful feminine. There's still this idea of a Da Vinci Code, right? There's a whole movie about it. And there is some debate over, was he trying to be subversive here? Now, next one on the list is Raphael. Again, we have to go through all the, of course, Ninja Turtles, right? And so, Leonardo, Donatello, we were talking about them. Michelangelo, we'll come back to him in a few minutes. But we have Raphael Santi. Yes, he has a last name. He is a painter who creates numerous Madonna with Child paintings. But his most famous work that is housed in St. Peter's Cathedral is, of course, the School of Athens. This is a whole wall. This is a huge thing. I love this. Is a gorgeous. It's basically a mural because how large it is, but it covers the entire wall basically. And he paints this, but notice this is a quintessential example of humanism because it's the Greco-Roman architecture that is prominent. It's based on antiquity. The two figures at the center there are actually Plato and Aristotle. However, we don't really know what he looked like, and so he actually painted himself in the photo. He also paints his friends, contemporaries. He paints Michelangelo. He paints Da Vinci. He paints Raphael. So he actually used Da Vinci's likeness to actually create Plato, Aristotle. There they are. And you notice here, one of the big things here is Plato is looking to the heavens for his answers. Aristotle's looking to the earth. So you have this, this idea that these are the center, one looking to the heavens, one looking to the earth. But in either case, they are illustrating order, unity, and symmetry. So Aristotle was on Here and Now. Again, a few other people, just so you notice that he paints all these famous people in there, including Zoroaster, which if you remember your world history course, you should remember who Zoroaster is. And of course, also, see Ptolemy, you see Euclid, so all you famous, for math issues. In addition, we have, of course, Michelangelo, one of the most famous of all, who's going to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which again, you can spend all day there. Just looking at it, by the way, no pictures are allowed. Unless you're very sneaky and just have your phone out listening to Rick Steves' audio tour and hit snap. Not that I would know anything about that. Now, of course, Michelangelo is commissioned to paint the Sistine Chapel. It took him 4 years laying on his back, on his scaffolding, painting his details. Think about this. He's doing this all not upright, not laying, he's laying on his back, painting above his head the entire time. Painting these scenes from the Bible in the dome of the Sistine Chapel. Guys, this is gorgeous. And of course, at the center of it, of course, is the creation of man as God reaches out and touches Adam to bring life to the world. This is commissioned by Pope Julius II. Now, at the far end, you see a very different painting. So on the back here, so let me get my cursor here. So right here, this is the wall. This is also a separate painting of Michelangelo. But there's a big difference here. The ceiling represents hope. It's very bright, right? You see the bright colors. It illustrates the old Bible scenes, right? Of creation, of early history, creation, right? But it also is painted from 1508 to 1512 during the early High Renaissance period. The side wall over here is painted years later. And this, you see the darker colors. This is the final judgment, as it's called. This is the judgment seat of Christ, where I believe my next slide, that's the ceiling totally. No, I don't have that picture right here. So if you look here, you see Jesus having the judgment seat of Christ. You see all these people down here are going to hell. This is a much more pessimistic view or look at the Renaissance period. And it represents Michelangelo's own kind of change of mindset over the years. It represents this idea that he became disillusioned with the Renaissance ideals and became much more pessimistic, and it represents in his artwork. But there are other important works that we need to look at for him as well. Of course, his statue of David, one of the most famous paintings he's ever does, which originally was in the courtyard. Now has been moved inside to preserve it. And then also the Pieta, what he considered his masterpiece, because it glorifies the Mary holding the limp body of Jesus, and it becomes his most kind of his masterpiece carved out of marble. And it's just beautiful to see in person. It's awe-inspiring. There we go. I thought I had this picture. Here's the Final Judgment. He paints again. You can see the dates there from 1536 to 1541. Again, this is 40 years later, and he's much more pessimistic now. As you see the dark colors, the dark images, life is not quite so, positive anymore. He's become very disillusioned with it. And again, comparison of the two. Why are these differences? Well, by the time we get to the 16th century and the High Renaissance period, we start seeing that perfection, right? So David is now portrayed as a manly man versus the more feminine portrayal of Donatello. Now, there's a couple more people we need to talk about, and that's what's called the Venetian School. Now, the Venetian School, again, this is Venice. So we went from Florence to Rome. Now we're up to Venice. And the Venetian School is another one of those important examples of the Renaissance period. And the most famous artist of this was Titian. And again, you see the painting here is of Diana. And again, this is Greek and Roman goddesses, right? This is the idea. But use of vivid color, movement. They actually create the illusion of movement in a still picture. Again, static figures, subtle colors. This is the style of Florentine art. The other one, of course, is the Venus. Again, this is a picture that is extremely famous, but it is this idea that, again, a non-religious figure. Now, High Renaissance had taken art to perfection. David, right? The statue of David by Michelangelo. So there was little that could be done to improve it. And so a new group known as Mannerists began to rebel against this high idealism. And the most famous of this was El Greco, who was going to paint in Spain, known as the Burial of Count Orgaz. But the idea of Mannerism is that, okay, screw this, we can't keep up with this high Renaissance perfection. It doesn't exist, right, in the real world. And it also represents the idea that they become more disillusioned. And so during this period, we start seeing that the Mannerists begin to rebel and say, no, screw all that. We're going to reject a reaction against the ideas of balance, symmetry, simplicity, use of real color. No. Let's make art for art's sake. And so they began to use unnatural colors and shapes that were elongated or exaggerated as a way to rebel against the Renaissance art. Last thing, just a brief thing here, and that is the idea of social status for artists. During the Middle Ages, artists were viewed as artisans, right? They could do things, but they weren't necessarily wealthy. But during the Renaissance, artists became viewed as geniuses. They were praised for creativity. They were seen as social equals with the upper classes, even garnering large sums of money. So art became this idea of genius through Renaissance art. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.